In the fog-drenched woods of Harbor's Edge, veteran Ethan Cole drives his crowbar into a slab of rusted steel buried beneath sand and roots. What he is prying open is no ordinary wreck. It is the skeletal husk of a ship hidden for decades, sealed tight as if the ocean itself tried to forget it. Beside him, his German shepherd Max bristles, a low growl rumbling from deep within his chest. Then, with a shriek of tortured metal, the hatch gives way. But what escapes is not treasure. It is a stench of decay and salt, the scent of death entombed with secrets. Ethan has not uncovered history. He has disturbed something far darker, something meant never to return to the light. Harbor's Edge, cloaked in its rolling fog and the hush of the Pacific, had always been Ethan's refuge, a place to escape the echoes of war. Yet tonight, the mist feels heavier, the silence sharper. For a man seeking peace, the forest now whispers only of buried sins waiting to be unearthed. Harbor's Edge woke to a morning that felt older than the town itself, a Pacific fog rolling in from the gray water and threading the coastal pines like damp silk. Wind pushed fine sand along the tide line in thin hisses, and gulls drifted as pale shapes in a sky the color of pewter. The air tasted of salt and iron, and the cold bit through layers, a chill that made windows rattle and the last porch light on Dock Street swing in a lazy oval. Behind the town, the forest rose in steep, dark folds, a barricade of lodgepole and shore pine that pressed right up to the backyards of the outermost houses. It was the kind of morning that reminded people why fences rusted faster here and why anything left unattended eventually belonged to the sea. Ethan Cole liked these mornings precisely because most people didn't. At 38, he had the lean, economical build of a man who had learned to save effort for when it mattered. He stood 6 feet even, shoulders squared but not puffed, with forearms threaded by pale scars that no longer drew questions. His jaw was cut cleanly, usually shadowed by a day or two of stubble. His hair, once a uniform brown, was now clipped short and showing gray at the temples, a premature frost that seemed to please the old fisherman who nodded to him at the co-op. His eyes were a weathered hazel, restless in public but steady when he fixed on a problem with his hands. He spoke softly as a habit, and people took it for shyness. The truth was that after long years deployed where loud things happened without warning, you learned to move through the world like a respectful guest. If he kept to himself in this little Oregon town, it was not because he disliked its people. He simply preferred their company at a distance where he could admire their rituals, the way they rolled crab pots and patched nets and laughed in steam above coffee, without the obligation to explain himself. Ethan lived in a cedar-shingled rental at the end of a sandy lane, 100 paces from a footpath that slipped between the last row of pines and the first backs of the dunes. He carried a small day pack by habit rather than need. Water, a length of paracord, a folding and trenching tool he had no intention of using but liked having near, and a headlamp whose batteries he checked the way other people check their phones. Matching him stride for stride was Max, his 8-year-old German shepherd, a big sable-gray male whose coat darkened along the spine and lightened to silver around the muzzle and ruff. Max's ears, tall and sharp as oars at attention, twitched like independent instruments taking constant readings. His gait was a tireless, ground-eating trot that said he could keep going long past the point when a human would ask for a sit-down. At 85 pounds, he was all muscle and confidence, built like a downhill sprinter, with a faint puckered line along the left flank, where a shard of something had once reminded both of them that training days didn't always end in the same shape they began. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and constantly aware of Ethan, checking in without ever breaking that easy patrol rhythm. There was a courtesy in the dog, a restrained seriousness that came from years of high-expectation work. Rewards mattered to Max, but doing the job correctly mattered more. When Ethan laced his boots on the porch that morning, Max had sat square and silent at the threshold, watching the fog tumble through the pines like a slow tide. And when Ethan rose, Max rose too, as if the two bodies ran on a common hinge. The footpath delved into the woods, and immediately the temperature dropped a shade. The air turned resinous with sap and damp bark, and the sound of the surf became a steady bass behind the hush of needles. Sand gave way to loam, then back to sand, as the path kinked around knotty roots and climbed a low saddle between two dunes. The forest here held secrets of the wind-downed limbs smoothed by salt, shotgun shells half buried at the base of snags, a broken crab buoy 3 ridgelines inland where no current could carry it. Ethan moved in that trained quiet that reads more as intention than stealth. He stepped where the ground would not announce him, and scanned without obviously scanning, letting his eyes graze over things, and then return as if by accident. He felt good in his body. This morning, sleep had been kind. The scar tissue in his right shoulder hadn't argued with the damp, and Max's enthusiasm was a current he was happy to be carried by. The first sign that the day meant to change arrived as a ripple along Max's spine. Hackles rose a fraction. The dog slowed mid-stride, head swiveling to the right, nostrils flaring as if they were hands trying to hold the scent still. Ethan's own hand went to the fixed blade on his belt habit. Again, not theater, and he gave a 2-note whistle he had once used to say, "Go easy, show me, we're fine." Max did not tense into aggression. Instead, he issued a low, breathy growl that had nothing of fury in it and everything of warning. Then he veered off the path into a screen of young shore pines and wax myrtle, moving with that sudden, precise confidence a handler learns to trust or else learn to lose. "What do you have?" Ethan murmured, following, using the back of his hand to push wet branches aside so they wouldn't snap and announce his approach. 10 paces in, the ground dropped into a shallow basin where the dune had slumped during winter storms. The soil here was a layered cake sand, pine duff, old sand again, and the last set of king tides had clearly clawed out a fresh bite. A wall of earth stood 5 feet high where the slope sheared clean, roots dangling like black hair. Embedded in that cut, at an angle like a whale showing a flank before sinking, was a plane of metal. Not aluminum, not corrugated, not the pitted, scabbed look of the usual junk you get when people drag appliances out and forget them. This was thicker, the color of old iron, mottled with crescents of orange rust and streaked where salt had wept down its face and dried. Max had gone still in the way that means attention, front paws planted on a knuckle of root, nose tilted toward the metal. He sniffed and then stepped sideways, sniffed again, mapping an invisible outline. Ethan climbed down the last bank, boots sinking to the ankle in cold, compacted sand, and put his gloved palm against the surface. It was cold as river stone. He rapped the flat of his knuckles, and the sound that came back was not hollow like a drum, but dense, a quality of echo that suggests more metal behind metal. He traced with his fingertips where the plane disappeared back into the earth. At first he thought Shipwreck, because the town carried a dozen stories like that. Even a weathered plaque on the boardwalk about a schooner that went down in '84 and still threw planks ashore after big blows. But the angle was wrong for a hull laid on its side by surf. This thing was wedged into the dune face, as if it had been dragged here and buried to the gunnels. He looked for hardware, rivets, anything to name it. There, beneath a smear of black lichen, was a seam too straight to be accidental, a trench line where two plates met. He cleaned it with the pad of his thumb, and the sand rasped like sugar on glass. "That's not fence, and it's not a beached pontoon," he said to Max, whose ears flicked, but whose gaze didn't leave the metal. Ethan eased his day pack off, zipped it open, and took out the compact entrenching tool. He disliked digging into coastal dunes. There were rules here for good reasons. And anyway, the ocean always took back what you took from it. But curiosity is a muscle that only strengthens when used. He kept his work tidy, scraping back what the tide had already exposed, freeing edges rather than plunging in. With each careful scoop, the geometry improved. The plate widened, then another seam appeared, and in the corner a heavy molded piece that could only be a hinge or something like it. The smell as he worked grew stronger, a stale, metallic damp that lives in sealed spaces, threaded with something almost sweet. The way kelp rots after it dries and gets wet again. He paused to let the air move. The fog made breath look like smoke. He listened the way he had learned to listen. Beyond birds, beyond surf, for the wrongness that announces company, and heard only the small noises of Max repositioning and the far slap of water on pilings. When he put the shovel down and tried the seam with his gloved fingers, rust dusted his palm. He fished the headlamp out, strapped it over his beanie, and thumbed it on. White light washed the metal and found an old stamp half erased, a run of letters he couldn't yet read. He smiled despite himself. The pleasure of puzzle and tool and time. It returned him to the person he liked being. With a multi-tool he carried more like a talisman than a need. He pried at a lip that only a certain kind of attention would have recognized as a lip. It gave a fraction with a dead, sticky sound, and a thread of air like a cough escaped stale mineral, ancient as a cellar. Max made that soft, uncertain sound in his throat that Ethan had learned to interpret as "I don't like it, but I'll go if you go." "We're just looking," Ethan said, not because Max understood language so much as he read confidence like weather. He worked a careful circuit, revealing enough to see the piece for what it was. Not an isolated scrap, not a guarded panel in a seawall, but the upper flank of a larger body lying canted in the dune. As more rust-stiffened bolts and more industrial seams came to light, the shape acquired a name that made his scalp pull tight. Ship. Not a racing sailboat or a rotted fishing skiff dragged high and left to settle. Something heavier, a coastal workboat maybe, with steel in its bones. Years of wind-driven sand and pinefall had built a blanket over it, and storms clawing at the edge had briefly pulled that blanket back. Somebody had helped the blanket along. He could feel it in the way logs had been stacked as if by accident, in the half-rotted mat of seagrass pinned with cobble like a hasty thatch. He followed Max's nose to a section where the dune curled over into a lip, and there, set into the metal like a promise broken and then welded over, was what he had half hoped not to find: a hatch. The welds were old but clean, a thick bead along all four sides, and the discoloration spread like bruising beyond it, proof of heat and effort. He could see where someone had once ground the surface smooth to hide the work, then left nature to finish the camouflage. He pressed his ear to the plate and heard only his own blood in the cartilage, a slow coastal drum. He set the shovel and tested leverage at the seam. The tool flexed with a small complaint, and he backed off, unwilling to snap a good thing out of impatience. Beside him, Max's breathing had shortened into that alert pant that keeps scent moving over the olfactory machinery. The dog pawed once at the sand, then stopped, He did not scratch at metal. He was well taught. Ethan looked up the bowl of the basin toward the notch where the footpath ran. The fog had thickened into a moving wall now, rank on rank of it, advancing inland as the tide turned. He checked his watch. The tide tables lived there the way they lived in the heads of men who make their living inside the calendar of the moon. High water would be in less than an hour, and this spot would go sloppy and treacherous long before then. The basin, a perfect trap for a man who liked his ankles intact. He closed his pack and shouldered it. He stepped back from the metal and cast around for a mark or something that would outlast an honest blow and not draw the wrong kind of attention from kids or bored adults. He found a V-shaped length of driftwood pale as bone and drove it into the slope at an angle pointing toward the hatch. He stacked 3 flat stones at the base, a small grammar he used in the woods that meant mine, remember. Then he took a last look at the plate, memorizing the texturing of lichen and scratch and bruise the way he had memorized faces in places where you were expected to be good at that. "We come back with the right tools," he said, and Max wagged once, small and decisive, as if to say, "Noted." They climbed out of the basin in the slipping, shifting sand, Max choosing the line like water would, Ethan following, boots digging for purchase, gloved hand catching a root, then another. At the lip he glanced back and the fog erased their work, softening edges, making everything look older and less interested in them. The wind carried a heavier salt now. Out on the flat he could hear the surf's tempo change into that accelerating gallop it gets when it runs out of room. He and Max regained the path as the first fingers of incoming water crawled up the lowest swales, darkening the sand in long tongues. Ethan paused, scanning not for pursuers, just for the simple safety of knowing you've left a thing the way you meant to. And then he nodded once and they ghosted back through the trees toward home. 2 figures stitched neatly into the fabric of a town that noticed almost nothing this early. Under his breath he said the thing aloud because words once spoken can anchor a thought. This isn't a normal wreck, somebody wanted it hidden here. By late morning the fog had thinned, but Harbor's Edge still wore its gray sky like a heavy coat. The streets glistened with salt dew, and the faint cry of gulls mixed with the creak of moored boats along the pier. Ethan Cole walked with his usual measured stride, Max keeping close to his left leg, the German shepherd's paws silent on the sidewalk. The discovery in the dunes lingered in his mind like a fresh wound, something deliberately hidden, welded shut, as if secrecy had mattered more than decay itself. Ethan wasn't a man inclined to superstition, but the air in that basin had been wrong, too stale, too guarded. Today he needed context, threads of history to braid into an answer, and there was only one place in town that might have them: the library. The Harbor's Edge Public Library sat on the corner of Main and Willow, a modest brick building with ivy climbing the south wall, and a green-painted door whose brass handle had been polished to a dull glow by decades of hands. Inside, it smelled of floor polish, dust, and the faint sweetness of paper left too long near the sea. Behind the main desk sat Grace Turner. Grace was 31, with hair the color of dark honey pulled into a practical braid that fell neatly over one shoulder. Her frame was slim, almost willowy, but there was a precision in the way she carried herself that suggested her mind moved faster than most around her. Her skin was fair, lightly freckled across the bridge of her nose, and her eyes were a striking gray-blue sharp, curious, the kind that missed very little. Though she had been raised in Harbor's Edge, she'd left for college and worked briefly in Portland before returning to care for her aging mother. That return had shifted her character. Where once she had been restless, she now carried a blend of responsibility and skepticism, a tendency to probe into things people preferred to leave untouched. She had a voice that was calm, crisp, sometimes carrying the faintest note of challenge. When Ethan stepped up to the counter, Max settling obediently at his heel, Grace glanced over her glasses and offered a polite but appraising smile. "You're not one of my regulars," she said. "I'm looking for some old newspapers," Ethan replied. His voice was low, steady, but polite. "Back in the 80s or 90s. Any records of accidents offshore, maybe supply vessels that went missing near town." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "We keep the Gazette on microfilm. Most people don't bother anymore. What's your interest?" "History," Ethan said evenly. "And maybe some curiosity." Her eyes lingered on him, reading the way a school teacher might read a half-true answer, but she didn't press. Instead, she stood, smoothing the front of her gray cardigan, and motioned for him to follow. She led him to a small room at the back, where an old microfilm reader sat humming faintly. She showed him the reels marked 1985 to 1990. "If you break it," she said, one corner of her mouth quirking upward, "you fix it." Ethan gave a small nod of thanks. For the next hour, he scanned page after page of brittle headlines, local council meetings, crab harvest tallies, high school sports scores. Then he stopped. September 1987. A headline. "Coastal supply vessel vanishes in storm." The story described a ship contracted to transport payroll and supplies to a regional bank in Newport, carrying several $1 million. It had radioed a routine check, then vanished somewhere off the shoreline not far from harbor's edge. Search parties scoured the beaches. Nothing was ever found. The article speculated on foul weather, piracy, even an inside job, but as weeks passed, the news dwindled, replaced by other stories. Ethan leaned back, the glow of the machine casting pale light over his face. The hatch in the dune no longer felt like a curiosity. It felt like an answer. Someone had dragged part of that vessel into the sand, and they had wanted it to stay lost. He thanked Grace, who looked at him with quiet interest. "Find what you wanted?" she asked. "Something to think about," Ethan said. When he stepped back onto Main Street, the day had darkened, clouds pressing low, a storm brewing offshore. He turned toward Tom's Diner, the one place in town where information, if not freely given, at least circulated. Tom Reeves owned the diner. He was 58, built broad through the chest and belly, with a thick mustache gone mostly gray. His hair was thinning but combed carefully back, and he had the kind of forearms that spoke of years lifting crates and working fry baskets. Tom had lived in Harbor's Edge all his life, and it showed in the weathered lines at the corners of his eyes and the way he knew every regular by name. He was respected in the way long routes are respected, not flashy, not loud, but immovable. Life had taught him caution. In his 20s, he had been caught in a financial dispute with a seafood company that nearly cost him the diner, and since then he had kept his dealings guarded, his trust slow to extend. When Ethan entered, Max at his side, the bell above the door chimed. A few locals sat in red vinyl booths, shoulders hunched over coffee, murmuring in low tones. Tom stood behind the counter, wiping down a plate. "What can I get you?" Tom asked, voice deep and gruff. "Coffee," Ethan said, sliding onto a stool. After a moment he added, "I was reading some old papers today. There was a story about a missing ship back in the 80s, disappeared near here." The shift in the room was instant. The murmurs died. A fork clattered onto a plate and wasn't retrieved. Tom's rag slowed, then stilled, He looked at Ethan, and something in his eyes cooled, like shutters being drawn. "Folks don't talk about that," Tom said flatly. "Why not?" Ethan asked, his tone mild but persistent. "Because it doesn't bring anything good," Tom replied. "Storms take things. That's all there is." His words carried the weight of finality, and around the diner men and women turned back to their food, though their shoulders had tightened, as if they were waiting for a storm inside the room. Ethan finished his coffee in silence. Max sat close, dark eyes sweeping the room, as if sensing the tension coiling in the air. When Ethan stood to leave, Tom's gaze followed him, unreadable. By the time Ethan reached his house on the edge of the pines, dusk had settled. The forest pressed close, shadows long, the sound of waves dull and heavy. He climbed his porch steps, Max bounding ahead, then stopped cold. On the wooden table by his door, a hunting knife stood buried to the hilt, the blade quivering slightly as if it had just been planted. The handle was made of polished antler, the steel still catching the last smear of daylight. Around the porch, the sand showed boot prints, heavy, deliberate, circling. Max growled low, teeth bared, ears forward. Ethan's jaw set, not in fear but in a grim recognition. Someone had marked him. Someone knew he had asked questions. He pulled the knife free, its weight solid and unfriendly in his hand, then turned to scan the tree line. The woods stood silent, the fog creeping back as night reclaimed the town. Inside, Ethan laid the knife on the table, poured water into Max's bowl, and sat for a long moment in the dim light. His mind moved with the same tactical clarity it always did under pressure. He had seen the wreck. He had stirred the silence. Now someone had answered. When the tide turned again, late in the night, he would return to the basin with tools in hand. Whatever waited behind that welded hatch was not meant to be left alone. The night settled over Harbor's Edge like a damp quilt, the fog rolling back in from the Pacific, thicker than before, muffling sound and smudging the edges of the moon. Ethan Cole walked silently along the dune path, Max close to his knee, the German shepherd's breath forming faint puffs in the cold air. He carried only what mattered: the compact shovel, the crowbar, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a pouch of water. The knife left on his porch hours earlier still weighed on his mind, but the memory of that welded hatch pulled harder. If someone had gone to the trouble of warning him away, it only meant there was something behind that steel worth hiding. Ethan wasn't built to ignore such things. The basin where the dune had collapsed looked even stranger under night. The fog pooled in its hollow, a pale smoke clinging to the sand. The driftwood marker Ethan had left was still there, its bleached arms pointing toward the hatch, and Max trotted ahead, tail stiff, ears pivoting, nostrils testing the air. The dog let out a low rumble, not aggression, but the sound of acknowledgement. The smell was still there, rust, rot, and something trapped too long. Ethan knelt, dug away what little sand the tide had pushed back, and uncovered the welded seams. He wedged the crowbar into the lip, braced his boots, and pushed. The hatch shrieked like a dying gull, flakes of rust raining down. Max flinched, then pressed himself against Ethan's leg, steadying him as much as watching the shadows. The seal gave at last, a line cracking open, exhaling a breath of air foul with mildew, salt, and something else sweet and rotten, the smell of long decayed flesh. Ethan clicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing into the darkness of the hold. What it revealed froze him. Two skeletons slumped in the forward seats, their frames held together by the ragged remains of uniforms. The cloth was mottled with mildew, eaten through in places, but the outlines of badges and faded company patches could still be seen. The bones lay tilted in unnatural repose, jaws open, ribs collapsed inward. Around their feet lay a scatter of brass casings, the dull green of corrosion clinging to the grooves. A shotgun, rusted nearly to dust, rested against one wall, its barrel warped. Ethan swallowed, his breath fogged in the flashlight beam. He had seen death, plenty of it. But here death had been sealed away, forgotten deliberately. Max whined softly, eyes locked on the skeletons, tail low but body steady. Then Ethan's light caught something small half-buried beneath a rib cage. He crouched, nudging aside a fragment of cloth, and lifted it free. A lighter, tarnished, its silver plating dulled by years. He wiped it against his sleeve. The engraving gleamed faintly, DM. The initials sparked questions he couldn't answer yet, but the weight of the lighter felt personal, intimate. He slipped it into his pocket. Max moved suddenly toward the rear of the hold, nose working furiously. Ethan followed, his flashlight sweeping the steel floor. That was when he saw it. A patch of plating darker than the rest, the welds clumsier, the discoloration too fresh compared to the surrounding rust. He knelt, tapped the surface with the butt of his crowbar. The sound rang differently, hollow, not solid. His pulse quickened. He set to work, levering at the seam. Rust resisted, then snapped in brittle flakes. The panel shifted, squealing in protest, and Ethan pried until it lifted. Beneath, wrapped in heavy plastic, lay stacks of rectangular bundles. He pulled one free, the plastic stiff but intact, and peeled back a corner. The green edges of $100 bills stared up at him, crisp despite the years. Dozens of bundles lay stacked below, a hidden fortune untouched. He exhaled through clenched teeth. Millions, easily. Enough to explain the silence in town, the knife on his porch, the way Tom Reeves's eyes had gone cold. Someone had hidden this wealth and built their life on keeping it buried. Before he could reach deeper, Max stiffened, ears pricking sharply, his body turning toward the dune ridge above. A growl vibrated in his chest, low and urgent. Then Ethan heard it too, the distant hum of engines. Not one, but two, heavy and throaty, the kind of vehicles that didn't belong on back roads unless they had a reason. SUV engines. Adrenaline flushed through him. He shoved the bundle of bills into his pack, forced the panel back down, scattering sand over it as best he could. He killed the flashlight, the hold plunging into darkness, and scrambled up the slope with Max pressed tight against his leg. The beams of headlights cut through the fog above, slicing the trees in white. Voices carried low, male, sharp. Ethan kept low, guiding Max toward the deeper woods, but a snap of branches betrayed him. "Over here!" someone shouted. A light swung, catching the basin edge. Ethan darted into the trees, Max at his side, the dog moving with silent precision. The first shots cracked behind him rifle fire, snapping through branches. He dropped low, angling downhill where the dunes broke into narrow gullies. The sand shifted under his boots, but his years of training guided his pace. Max surged ahead, then veered suddenly. A man with a flashlight and a rifle stumbled into view, cursing. Max lunged, teeth clamping onto the weapon's stock, twisting with brutal force. The rifle clattered free, the man yelling in pain as he stumbled back. Ethan didn't pause. He grabbed a branch, swung it hard into the man's shoulder, sending him crashing into the sand. Another voice shouted from the ridge. More lights cut through the fog. Ethan zigzagged, using the dunes as cover, heart pounding, Max staying tight by his side. The forest grew denser ahead, roots and underbrush giving him the advantage. He knew how to lose pursuit. He had done it before in darker places than this. He dropped low, crawled under a fallen pine, then doubled back, circling wide until the shouts grew fainter, the flashlights bobbing in the wrong direction. He paused, chest heaving, listening. Only the sound of surf and Max's steady breathing filled the dark now. Ethan rested a hand on Max's flank. "Good boy," he whispered. The dog's tail thumped once, quick. Then he turned his head, eyes still scanning the shadows. They stayed in silence for long minutes, hidden in the undergrowth, until the SUV engines roared again, fading into the distance. Whoever they were, they hadn't given up. But tonight, Ethan and Max had escaped. When they finally reached the safety of the narrow trail leading back toward the town's edge, Ethan adjusted the weight of the pack on his shoulder. Inside was the bundle of bills, proof of what lay beneath the sand. Proof someone would kill to protect. And in his pocket, the lighter engraved with DM, a clue, small but damning. He glanced back once at the darkened basin swallowed in fog. The hatch was closed again, but it wouldn't stay hidden forever. He knew he'd return, and so would whoever had come tonight. The wind came in restless off the Pacific, rattling the cedar branches above Ethan Cole's cabin. The place was little more than a one-room shack pressed against the forest line, its roof patched with tin, its walls weathered gray by salt air. He had chosen it years ago for its isolation, but tonight that same seclusion made the dark outside feel heavier, as if the trees themselves leaned closer. Inside, the glow of a single oil lamp threw long shadows across the scarred pine table where Ethan sat with Max lying at his feet. The German shepherd's head rested on his paws, but his amber eyes flicked often toward the door, ears twitching with every distant sound. Ethan set the tarnished Zippo lighter on the table, the initials DM gleaming faintly in the light. He had spent years in combat zones where every clue mattered, and he trusted his instincts now. This lighter wasn't random, it was personal. Pulling his laptop closer, he connected the small satellite modem he kept for emergencies. The connection was slow, but reliable enough. He logged into a digitized archive of county newspapers and property records, his fingers moving with deliberate patience across the keys. It didn't take long. Daniel Murphy. The name appeared again and again, first as a deputy in the sheriff's department during the late 1980s, then suddenly absent. An article dated 1988 explained he had taken early retirement, citing stress and family commitments. But public records told another story. Within 2 years, Murphy had acquired 2 parcels of land on Harbor's Edge, then opened a construction business. By the mid-1990s, he owned half the town's waterfront properties. A man with no visible fortune had become its quiet baron. Ethan leaned back, the lighter cold in his palm. The initials fit too neatly. A deputy tasked with investigating a missing ship, retiring just when the trail went cold, then rising inexplicably wealthy. It was no coincidence. His jaw tightened. He organized the photographs he had taken the night before. The skeletal remains in their seats, the shotgun rusted to decay, the secret hatch with stacks of cash still pristine, and the Zippo lighter. He zipped the files into an encrypted folder and composed a message. His recipient was Mark Jensen, a former comrade from Afghanistan, now a field agent in Chicago. Jensen was the kind of man who had been tempered by fire. Tall, dark-haired, with lines around his eyes that came from both laughter and too many funerals. Once, outside Kandahar, Ethan had pulled him from the wreckage of a convoy. That kind of bond didn't vanish. His message was short, factual, stripped of speculation. Found wreck, 2 confirmed deceased, evidence of robbery and cover-up, high-value cash stash intact. Prime suspect Daniel Murphy, ex-deputy, wealthy rise post, 1988. Attached photos. He added a final line. Need verification. Potential FBI jurisdiction. Locals compromised. Then he hit send. The green light on the modem blinked, then steadied. The message was gone. But he didn't stop there. Ethan knew the machinery of federal law took time, and time was not on his side. Whoever had hunted him last night wouldn't wait politely for warrants. He needed a public spark, something that would spread faster than a bullet could silence. That was when he thought of Grace Turner. The young librarian had surprised him with her sharp eyes, her quiet curiosity. What most of Harbor's Edge didn't know was that Grace ran a local blog in her spare time. The Edge Chronicle, a place where she wrote about local history, lost lore, and sometimes the things townsfolk preferred to forget. She kept it anonymous, but Ethan had noticed her style, her fingerprints in the way she framed stories with careful skepticism. He created a new anonymous email account, attached only one photograph, the Zippo lighter with the initials DM etched deep in its face. The subject line read, "Ask Daniel Murphy what he dropped in 1987. The body of the message was shorter still. Some things don't stay buried forever. He sent it to the Edge Chronicle's tip line, knowing Grace would see it. Max stirred then, his ears pricking, a soft growl escaping his throat. Ethan froze, listening. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint crack of a branch. He reached for the hunting knife on the table. For a long moment, the night held its breath. Then silence again, the ocean's dull roar resuming its rhythm. Max relaxed, though his tail thumped once, restless. By dawn, the email had traveled further than Harbor's Edge had in decades. Grace, in her small apartment above the library, woke to the ping of the tip line. She wore her blonde hair loose that morning, falling around her shoulders in soft waves, her skin pale from long nights spent reading microfilm and scribbling notes in margins. Her curiosity was a sharp blade, one that had already gotten her scolded by the town council for posting about abandoned canneries and forgotten lawsuits. But this tip stopped her cold. She opened the photograph, her breath catching. The initials stared back at her. DM. She didn't know what it meant yet, but her instincts told her this was dynamite. By mid-morning, the photo was live on her blog. Local artifact surfaces, mystery initials, long-whispered rumors reignited. At the diner, men hunched over their coffee muttered when the post spread through town smartphones. In the real estate office on Main, Daniel Murphy himself sat behind his desk, silver hair slicked back, his frame broad though softening with age. He wore a tailored navy suit, a gold ring flashing on his finger. To most, he was the picture of Harbor's Edge respectability, a benefactor, a self-made success. But when his secretary slid her phone across the desk, showing him the photo, the color drained from his face. His blue eyes hardened, and his jaw, still strong despite his years, clenched until a vein stood out in his temple. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. The secretary shrugged nervously. "It's on the Chronicle. Everyone's talking about it." Murphy stood abruptly, the chair scraping back. For decades he had lived by one code: bury the past deep enough, and no one would dig. But now someone had pried open his grave. His wealth, his power, all of it balanced on a single careless mistake made long ago. And someone had the lighter. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number from memory. "It's Murphy," he growled when the line picked up. "We have a problem. Whoever's stirring this up, they have to be found." Ethan, unaware of Murphy's first moves but anticipating them, stood at his cabin window, watching the morning tide roll in. He laid a hand on Max's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath thick fur. The board was set. The spark had been struck. Now he knew the fire was coming. The night along harbor's edge was a black curtain, the fog thicker than glass, muffling even the crash of the Pacific waves. Ethan Cole crouched on the ridge above the basin where the wreck lay, his eyes scanning through the dim green of a borrowed night vision monocular. Max lay low beside him, the German shepherd's body taut, every muscle coiled like wire. The tripwires Ethan had set earlier thin fishing lines strung low, tied to cans filled with pebbles waited in silence for a careless footstep. He had chosen his ground well. If Murphy came, it would be here. The first sound was the low hum of engines. Black SUVs crawled along the rough track, headlights killed, moving like shadows. Doors opened with quiet thuds, and 3 figures emerged. Daniel Murphy himself came last. At 62, he still carried the frame of the deputy he once had been. Broad-shouldered, silver hair combed neatly, his tailored coat buttoned against the night air. Yet the darkness in his expression outweighed the refinement. His jaw was clenched, his blue eyes hard and restless, like a man cornered by ghosts. The 2 men with him were muscle, younger, heavy-set. The first was Kane, a barrel-chested brute with a shaved scalp and a crooked nose that spoke of too many bar fights. He moved with the swagger of someone who relied on brute force more than thought. The second was Rivas, leaner but no less dangerous. His dark beard cut close, eyes sharp and restless. His leather jacket creaked as he scanned the trees, rifle at the ready. Neither spoke much. Their loyalty to Murphy was of the sort bought with money and bound by fear. They moved cautiously toward the ravine, flashlights cutting thin slices through the mist. The sound came suddenly, the sharp clatter of cans rattling as Rivas snagged one of the tripwires. His curse split the air. Max surged forward at Ethan's command, a blur of gray and black fur, low and fast as a phantom. He slammed into Rivas before the man could bring his rifle up, jaws snapping onto the stock, twisting violently. The weapon flew from his hands, clattering against a rock, and Rivas cried out, stumbling back. Kane swung his own rifle up, but Ethan was already moving, launching from his cover with a brutal efficiency that came from years of muscle memory. He drove the butt of his crowbar into Kane's ribs, a sharp crack of bone and breath. Kane doubled over, and Ethan followed with a knee to the jaw that sent the man sprawling unconscious into the sand. That left Murphy. The old man had drawn a pistol, and its muzzle flared in the dark. Bullets ripped through the mist, shattering against stone, whining past Ethan's head. Murphy's voice rose with each shot, ragged, furious. "It's mine," he bellowed. "All of it is mine. I built this town with it. Do you hear me? Nobody takes it away." The confession tumbled out in blind rage, his words damning. "They trusted me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Those guards fools, I set it all up." No storm, no accident. It was my plan, and it worked until you dug it up. Ethan moved low across the sand, Max circling wide, growling deep and steady. Murphy fired again, the pistol bucking in his hand. His face was pale now, sweat glistening at his temples despite the cold. The mask of respectability stripped away to reveal something raw and desperate. Then, cutting through his rant, came another sound. The faint, rising wail of sirens. It carried through the night air, distant but closing. Murphy faltered, his eyes snapping toward the sound. Flashing blue lights flickered at the edge of the trees as black SUVs with FBI insignia roared into the clearing. Murphy turned wildly, gun still raised, but Ethan stepped from cover, voice calm, low, controlled. "It's over, Daniel. You've run out of places to bury the truth." The beam of tactical flashlights swept the basin as federal agents poured in. "Drop it!" one shouted. Murphy spun, but the fight had drained out of him, replaced by the hollow weight of inevitability. His pistol clattered to the sand. Within seconds, agents surged forward, pinning him to the ground, locking steel cuffs around his wrists. Kane and Rivas were hauled up too, groaning, their weapons already secured. Special Agent in Charge Roberts, tall and composed, approached Ethan with a firm nod. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we got your evidence, your photos, your testimony." And now his confession. He gestured to the crumpled figure of Murphy, face pressed into the sand, his silver hair disheveled, his voice now a hoarse whisper of denial. Teams swarmed the wreck, cataloging the hidden bundles of cash, lifting the lighter sealed in a plastic evidence bag, photographing the skeletal remains that had been locked away for decades. The past was no longer buried. It was recorded, undeniable. Ethan stood back. Max pressed against his leg, the dog's chest rising and falling steady after the fight. He rested a hand on the shepherd's thick fur, grounding himself. Dawn had begun to touch the horizon, faint bands of rose and gold peeling back the dark. The fog thinned, revealing the endless stretch of the Pacific, its waves catching the first light. Ethan knelt, wrapping his arms around Max, pressing his forehead to the dog's warm neck. The shepherd gave a low rumble, then licked his cheek, grounding him further than any words could. Ethan exhaled long and slow. The weight of secrets, of old crimes, of ghosts that had haunted the dunes and the town lifted with the morning mist. For the first time in years, he felt peace fragile but real. The nightmare of Harbor's Edge had ended where it began, in the sand by the sea. But what it left behind was something truer: justice, light, and the quiet strength of loyalty between a man and his dog. In the end, the greatest treasure wasn't the money buried in the sand, but the truth finally brought to light. Just like Ethan and Max uncovered what was hidden, God calls us to face our own shadows and trust that His light will always guide us. Miracles don't always come in the form of gold or fortune. Sometimes they come through loyalty, courage, and the quiet reminder that we are never alone when we walk with Him. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others, leave a comment below, and subscribe to our channel. And may the Lord bless and protect every one of you who watched today, because sometimes the miracle you're waiting for is already on its way.